कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Welcome to Kitaabnama, Books and Beyond. My guest today is the Libyan emigre writer Hisham Matar. I'm very pleased to be able to speak to him. Hisham, you've written 2 novels, and before we got to the wider social situations in them, I wanted to ask you about the one thing that's common in them is that there's both of them have a child narrator. And what is it like to write a whole book about an adult world from the point of view of a child?
Well, I think first of all, it happened organically. It wasn't something that I had decided on. They are actually adults who are reflecting towards, certain moments in their childhood. And I think being a child, it's such a, your perceptions of the world around you are so new and intense and fresh, but also you're not told the whole story. Yes. All children are not told the whole story. And within a politically very tensed environment, a dictatorship that, in a sense, behaves as if the populace are made up of children and therefore should not be told the whole story. We know best for them and so on. Seems an interesting, an interesting way to structure these narratives.
From your first book, readers have a sense of what your own life was like, and I wanted to ask, for the benefit of viewers of the show, what was your childhood like in Libya, and what are the circumstances in which you staged a very long drawn-out escape from that country?
Well, I had a very happy childhood in Libya. It's a childhood that was surrounded by a very large family, and Libya is a very beautiful country for a child because you have the sea, you have all the light, and it's it was a very warm childhood. But all of that was disrupted by the moment towards the end of the 1970s when the Gaddafi regime started to really crack down on intellectuals and imprisoned many writers. In fact, a whole generation of promising writers were imprisoned in Libya through this very little known event, but a dramatic event within the Libyan context, which was that in the late 1970s, the state staged a literature festival, as we are, it was a literature festival, and the most promising young writers were invited to this festival. And then it was a trap. They were all arrested en masse, put in prison, and they spent on average about 10 years in prison. So now if you're talking to any Libyan writers who were born, say, in the 50s or in the 60s, or early 60s, from the mid-50s to the early 60s, you'd find that they either spent time in prison or they knew someone who spent time in prison. This was very damaging to Libyan literature, a literature that was already, weak, starting out after a terrible time of, our colonial experience was particularly vile, I think, under the Italians. And so the late 1970s was another kind of, spasm in this process of the dictatorship narrowing civic society and the arts. And so we left as a family. Then we went to Egypt, and it was a drawn-out escape because we left, but my father couldn't leave. Eventually, he was able to catch up with us a year later, and we made a life for ourselves in Egypt. So my upbringing is really colored both by Libya and Egypt. They're neighboring countries that I feel very attached to.
In a sense, after you left Libya, you regained your father in Egypt, and yet tragically you sort of lost him there too. And I would like to hear you tell that story of what happened then.
Yes, my father was member of the opposition, and he was one of the more prominent dissidents in exile. And so dictatorships, it's a universally known fact that dictatorships might disagree on a lot of things, but one thing that they agree on is, you know, continuing their reign. Yes. And so the intelligence services between, say, Egypt and Libya were on very good terms, even when the regimes weren't necessarily on very good terms. And so my father was handed over by the Egyptian intelligence security services to their Libyan counterparts. And he really entered into what many Libyan political dissidents went through, which is long incarceration without trial, without allowing the family to visit, without even informing the family where the person is. And then he was amongst the unlucky ones who disappeared within the... we have not thankfully as large as countries like Argentina and so, but we have a significant number of political dissidents who disappeared in prison. Don't know when they died, how they died, where they are. And he was one of those.
A perennial theme in literature is that of the missing father and what he leaves behind, all the way from Homer down to our times. And what was your own way of writing about this, and why did you choose the form of the novel in which to talk about, if not your own autobiographical memories which you want to put in fiction, the particular feeling of having lost somebody and you don't know whether this person is still alive or not?
Both of my novels involve fathers that are made to disappear in some way or another. I'm not necessarily interested in telling my story. I think I'm doing what all novelists do. I'm using a particular knowledge that I have from my own observations, experiences, in order to create art, in order to meditate over a certain aspect of human life. It seems to me disappearance has taught me something about loss that isn't particular to disappearance. It's a universal thing about loss, the character of loss. When somebody dies, it's tragic, but it's final. And you know, if you're lucky, you know where they're buried. You can go and conduct whatever rituals that you wish to conduct, mark the ending. But when someone disappears, the quality of grief is very different. The weight of it is very different, because the possibility that they are alive at this particular moment, it's not an abstract, you know, hereafter, you know, but that they're alive at this particular moment, under the same sun, under the same moon, at this exact minute, is a vivid one, and it alters your experience of grief, but it also alters your experience of joy, of how you eat a good meal, you know, how you put on a new piece of garment. It alters a lot of these things. And it seemed to me a worthwhile thing, and maybe even an act of artistic resistance is the wrong word, but it's an act of artistic rebellion against dispossession, because by virtue of what the dictatorship was doing wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. To silence somebody, to remove him totally, to steal him, right? And so it seemed to me an interesting thing to try to create something, you know, and hopefully something that is coherent, interesting, beautiful, you know, all the things that novels can be, and that can be universal too, not specific to this experience. So it seemed like a challenge worth undertaking.
Your first book, the background is very specifically realized. You tell right away that this is Libya of the 1970s. In your second, the background is vaguer, and readers have to work much harder to put together a sense of where exactly this book is set. What explains the divergence in the two kinds of background you orchestrate for these novels?
So in the Country of Men is set in Libya during the late 1970s, that period that I mentioned, that is of a very interesting transition in Libyan life. And it tells the story of a family that's living there, and the father is politically involved in the underground resistance. And then various consequences happen to that. But it's really all told through the point of view of the child, who knows very little about what is really behind what he's seeing, and therefore his imagination fills in the gaps, sometimes to dire consequences. And it's a populated novel, populated by Libya and the sounds and life of Libya. My second novel takes some of the themes, but tries to drive a deeper groove to tell the very complex relationships within a family that are affected by an outside political force. And I think what I'm interested in both books, some of the common, even though they're very different, but some of the common ground between them, is that I am interested in how politics affects family life. So for example, it seems to me an abstraction to speak about politics within the political, discourse. What I'm more interested in is how does that sort of reality affect how people deal with each other, how a man might kiss a woman, how a child might, relate to his parent or his sibling or friend. So I wanted to take those and just drive deeper and not have it hinged on a particular Middle Eastern country with a particular history. I mean, if someone knows the codes, there are codes there that make it explicit, or not really explicit, but that make it so that they have to be from Iraq, yes, because some of the events that happen. But it seems that the experience that they've gone through is similar to a lot of other Arabic countries. And I was trying to broaden the narrative by not making it specific like that.
I'm sure that among your own artistic influences are those that belong neither to like the classical Western tradition or to a very specifically Libyan sort of background. So I would like our viewers would like to hear you speak about other novelists you admire.
Yes, I mean I read widely and not necessarily according to cultural lines. I've read many of your wonderful authors in India. I've read many Latin American writers, particularly when I was young. Latin American writers and Indian writers seem to show a path for people like me, because we share so many common grounds in our history, in our post-colonial history. But then later on, as I grew as a writer and as a reader, I've engaged with many different texts. I suppose if I were having to mention writers that have sustained my curiosity for a long period of time, someone like Marcel Proust, the French novelist, would be there, mainly because I think he is doing something very interesting in his ability to touch on the specific private moment and be able to tell you so much beyond that. And that is just a fantastic thing as a reader,
What is it you think that explains why dictatorships are so interested in repressing literature, when we see in democratic countries that literature tends to be quite a small part of popular culture?
Yes, that's such an interesting question. I mean, there are many obvious answers that I'm sure you have come to too, that to do with the subversive nature of literature. That literature is interested in complexities, in opposing empathies, in characters that are running against their hearts, in contradictions, and sustaining those contradictions. All of the things that dictatorship isn't interested in. But I think another reason why dictatorship is particularly sensitive, because it's actually quite curious to what extent the Libyan dictatorship paid attention to literature. I mean, it could be accused of many sins, but not paying attention to literature is not one of them. And I think it's because it too was involved in fiction. I grew up watching this program that would come on 3-4 times a day, 5-10 minutes of it. And it showed you a synopsis of Libyan contemporary history according to the dictatorship. So you had Italian colonialism, the fascists in Libya and the terrible things they did, the people that hung in the streets and so on. The next moment, you had Gaddafi marching on Tripoli. So it's as if King Idris and independence didn't happen, as if sort of all of those years between 43 when the British defeated the Italians in North Africa, from 43 to 69 was erased, according to this reel. So I think dictatorship is involved in rewriting history and telling you what the present is, and it's a singular vision. There is not one different way of, different ways of interpreting it. And it also has very specific ideas about the future. It knows what, under Gaddafi we knew what books to read, what books not to read, what to say, what not to say, no?
It's like a great parent who...
Yeah. So the novel, poetry, the arts in general are so much different. They're interested in exactly the opposite. And they by nature, not necessarily deliberately, not politically, but by their own existence, they fight everything that is meaningless and thoughtless and careless about the world. All of the absurdities of dictatorship are challenged by the specific nature of an artist alighting on a detail and just describing that detail. That in itself is subversive, I think, too.
In the 21st century, do you think the world has fragmented enough now that dictatorship is no longer viable in the particular way it was at that moment in time throughout the 20th century in all these places across the world?
I'd like to think that. I'm not sure. I'd like to think that. I think history at the moment is moving at such a pace, it's so fast, and a challenge to us as writers, and I think particularly as novelists, is how do we respond to that? Because the pace of it is so fast right now. The fracturing and the various pressures that are put on societies are immense and very, very quick. And the patience to engage with the specific is deteriorating. So those two things have, I think, put the novel in a very interesting, in front of a very interesting creative challenge, I think.
A lot of Indian readers, unfortunately, what they know of African literature is kind of backdated generation, as these things tend to be. And so the African writers they know are from the 60s or 70s, Chinua Achebe, Walt Soyinka. I was wondering if you would try to make a slightly different map of your own favorite African writers and tell us about 2 or 3 books that you admire in particular.
Well, you're talking to somebody who, not by design, but by default, most of the writers that I read are no longer alive. So most of them will be sadly older writers. But just to say something about this connection between India and, not necessarily, Africa is a very big, complex place, but to Libya, it's a very powerful connection because all of my cousins that went to university in Libya, all of their English literature professors were from India. In fact, when I was in Libya last time, I met some of them, right? So at least from Libya, India doesn't feel far away at all. It feels very close. And certainly growing up, there were many Indian engineers and people working in various different industries. So books from Africa. One of my favorite books from Africa is a novel by Tayyib Saleh, who was sadly passed away, a writer from the Sudan. So Sudan is a very interesting country because it has the identity of being both African and Arab, like Libya, but unlike Libya, Libya has a very large, almost half of our population is of very, very dark skin. But obviously Sudan is all of very dark skin. So the situation with them has always been complex because Arabs treat them as Africans, Africans treat them as Arab. And Tayyib Saleh pens a beautiful novel called Season of Migration to the North that I think is just remarkable. And it's considered internationally as, amongst the classics of world literature. The other novelist that I'm partial to from that continent is Naguib Mahfouz, the Egyptian novelist, maybe more familiar here than Tayyib Saleh. Certainly wrote much more than Tayyib Saleh. And then you mentioned, of course, Chinua Achebe and the various, young South African writers that work there. I chair the, I don't chair, sorry, I'm one of the trustees of the Kane Prize for African Literature. And so I read a lot of the young, attempts by young writers, and it just fills me with optimism. The thing that does depress me is perhaps a problem that you might have here too, which is that in the more poorer regions, where education isn't as well provided, where books are expensive or not affordable, I mean, you see talent, but without the reading, without the weight of literature behind it. And that really, and if anything, was to make it clear that reading and education for writers is just so important. That for me just made it.
Your two books, one of them is set in Libya, but of course Libya has changed now, and for the first time in many decades there's a life beyond Gaddafi. I was wondering if you had the temptation now not so much to crack history as to try and work a step in advance of it and try and imagine what the future Libya might be like that's beyond the range of its 20th century past.
Well, I know from the books that I've written, I haven't written many, I've written only two, but I've known from them that I can't choose what to write. That writing for me is a series of implications. You start with an image, with a sentence, sometimes with a feeling. Anatomy of a Disappearance started outside of language for me. It started with a feeling for Nouri, the main character. And I was curious about him, I wanted to know more about him. And then I'm implicated, really. From that moment on, I become like a servant. I'm not, I really don't feel the authority of the author that knows all the facts and is pushing the book forward. I'm a different kind of author who is dancing in the dark and trying to find things out. So I write almost as a reader, and I am totally, my whole life is held by the book as I'm writing it. For that reason, I think, and I enjoy that. I enjoy that challenge. Right now, I'm writing a book that is about Libya, but it's about the current situation. And it's not a novel, it's more of a memoir. And it's really an attempt to try to look back and look at the present and try to think about all of that. I'm terrible at talking about a book that I am writing. I'm slightly less bad at talking about a book that I've written, but the one that I'm writing, I'm not very good at. Yeah.
Hisham, it was a great pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in today to Kitaabnama, Books and Beyond.
I'm reading this from my book, my novel No Country, where one of the characters, he's a young boy, and it's 1914, and he has gone to the Ganges, where in the Strand, where a celebration is taking place. He's curious, and he runs in, and he falls, and a regimental officer reached out and picked me up with ease. I took in with great admiration his navy blue uniform, his red stripe and sash, and the splendid sword at his waist. "Did you hurt yourself, child?" asked a young lady in a white dress. "What is your name?" asked another woman with blonde hair. "I am Robert Patrick Ahern, sir." "And where is your father?" "Robert Patrick Ahern?" The old lady frowned. "Here?" "No, ma'am," I said, feeling very grown up. "My father is Brendan Ahern. He's at home," I added. "We live on Elliot Road." "Elliot Road, did you say?" snorted the old lady, glaring at the army officer. "Lieutenant Harrison, am I to understand that Anglo-Indians are coming to here today?" "He's just a child," began the officer. Her eyes blazed as she shook her shiny yellow head, and I watched fascinated as she licked her grey teeth with a slippery pink tongue. Then she turned to me and said, "Chi-chi." She hissed at me, "Chalo idhar se." "Get away from here," it meant in Hindustani. I knew that. The army man picked me up under my arms and swung me back into my father's brougham. After all these years, I still remember the sting. Then I saw the soldiers marching in formation. Our brougham had to stand aside to let them pass. I did not know then that the Great War of 1914 had just been declared, and this was its celebration. The bagpipes were strident. I have often thought since then of the numberless columns of Indian soldiers in formation behind their police officers, behind their British officers, many of them Irish, who died of bullets, poison gas, or despair in soggy trenches and bomb-cratered fields, in places with unfamiliar names like Ypres or Passchendaele and Verdun, beginning their first march towards death here in Calcutta. Those who survived would return to a different world, both changed irretrievably. This is a segment from my book, No Country.